Hey everybody, I hope you're all having a fantastic week this week. As we look and as we go dig into our Bible study this week, we're going to be looking at a story that we've probably heard a lot, especially if you grew up in church. We'll be looking at the story of Joshua and the destruction of Jericho. In our chapter today, last week we saw that two weeks ago we saw they crossed to the Promised Land by God drying up the Jordan River. Last week we looked at the first Passover in the Promised Land and Joshua's encounter with the commander of the Lord's army in chapter 5. And then today in chapter 6, we're going to look at Jericho and just look at this story and dig a little deeper to see how we can apply it to our lives today. So first of all, we're going to read one verse from chapter 5. Which I think, kind of applies we can make the parallel to this passage today because it kind of makes sense. It kind of sets the tone for the reason why things are happening a certain way in the city of Jericho in chapter 6. So chapter 5 verse 1 says, "As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel." So because of what God had done, word had gotten out. We remember a couple weeks ago we looked at the Rahab and the spies, and people had heard about what was going on with the nation of Israel. People heard about God parting the Red Sea, how the God had given them victory. And here this is even making them even, more concerned and more worried because they're hearing for it and it's happening closer to home. So they see this miraculous thing and hear about this miraculous thing happening, and then they decide that they need to do something. So we're going to look in chapter 6. We're going to look at the first 11 verses to start off with. "Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, you will hear the sound of the trumpet. Then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city fall down flat. And the people shall go up, everyone straight before him.' So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, 'Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord.' And he said to the people, 'Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men pass before the ark of the Lord.' And just as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priest and were blowing the trumpet, who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard were walking after the ark, while the trumpets blow continually. But Joshua commanded the people, 'You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout.' So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp." So here we see, in this passage, we see the first preparing for battle. So Joshua tells them what to do. God comes to Joshua, the Lord comes to Joshua, and tells them what to do. The thing is that the people in the land were scared. We saw that in verse 5. Chapter 5, verse 1, we also saw in the first verses here, where Jericho was shut up tight. No one was coming in and no one was going out. They had stopped all flow of traffic in and out. The walls in Jericho were probably high. It was a fortification. It was actually, I believe, I saw several pictures and heard several people say that Jericho was actually built on a hill anyways. So not only was it built on a hill, but it was high up. So it was extra fortified. They could see everyone around them. They could see who was coming from a far ways off. And so, that gave them the advantage in battle. And that's why they did it. They wanted to protect themselves and all of that. And so, people in the land, they were scared. They had heard that they had crossed the Jordan. And they lost their will to fight. They just didn't want to fight them. They knew that they would lose. So they did everything they could. They shut themselves up in their cities, in their walled cities, hoping that would protect them. Joshua gives his orders. Now, we read this, and it's kind of a weird situation. It's more like a ritual kind of thing if you look at it, right? Because, the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to march around one time, the priest blowing the trumpet in celebration or whatever it was. And, they were specific. It didn't say just, have the priest blow the trumpets, ram's horns. It was 7 priests with 7 trumpets of ram's horn. And so, it's interesting as you look about this. They would march around the city, one time a day for 6 days. And then, of course, on the 7th day, they were supposed to, walk around the Jericho 7 times. And then they would, priests would blow the trumpets. That Joshua would command the armies to shout, and the walls would fall down. We see that, what God told them to do and what would happen in the first couple verses here. And so, we see that a lot of times numbers have importance in the Bible. And there's all kinds of people that you can look at and study. You can see probably things on YouTube or Instagram or wherever it talks about numbers in the Bible. And for number 7 is one of those numbers. We see the number 7 many times, and it talks about it's pretty much it's called the number of perfection or the number of completion. The number of completion. So they were told to do this, and after they did that, after they completed everything, we saw the walls would fall down. But another interesting thing that we see here is that the army was supposed to be quiet. They weren't supposed to talk. Their voice wasn't supposed to be heard. The only thing that they were supposed to hear was the sound of the trumpets blowing. So as they were walking around, they couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't get excited. They couldn't tell others what was going on. They just had to sit around and walk around the city quiet while the trumpets were blowing. It's interesting because God gives them very specific instructions about what to do. And they had a choice. They could either follow them or not follow them. Not follow them. And if they would follow them, they would have victory. And we see sometimes that's what happens. Obedience leads to victory in our lives. And then we see that they followed, they obeyed, and we see what happens. And we read that in verses 12 to 21. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord walked on. And they blew the trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. So they did this for 6 days. On the 7th day they rose early at the dawn of day, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid messengers that we sent. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. So we're really going to see here, and we'll look at this a little bit in a minute, but we see that God devoted the entire city, everyone within the city, for destruction, with the exception of Rahab. So we see that the people were told to march around the 7th day, right? So they're preparing, they're marching around 7 times. They're probably tired of this by now. They had already marched around, 6 times. And so all of a sudden they're going to march around 7 times to make 13. And then they're just what's going to happen? Well, Joshua told them what was going to happen, but, a lot of times we got to see things for ourselves. So Joshua, whenever he tells them to shout, he gives them this speech. He gives them this speech. This is important for them to know and understand. God devoted to and wanted to wipe out everyone in the city because he was afraid of the negative influence that those people would have on the nation of Israel. And we'll look later on and we'll see what happens whenever the children of Israel don't listen to God when it comes to this. When they try to bring people in or do things and they mix, not only they mix with other people that were in the city, but they bring in their religion, and it mixes the religion of Israel and the religion of pagan religions together. And that just causes problems upon problems upon problems for the nation of Israel throughout their history. Not just here at this point, but throughout their whole entire history as a nation. And part of the problem, part of the reason they did that. So they were to destroy everyone and everything within the city. Now, there are some special things that God wanted to keep for the Lord's treasury. Things like silver and gold, bronze and iron vessels, things that would be used in, building the temple or the tabernacle at some point. It was to go into the Lord's treasury, as it said in our passage. It's in our passage. And so we see this and that the people are, to be destroyed except for Rahab because, God kept his promise to Rahab. And we'll look at that a little bit here in a second. But the interesting thing, one of the most interesting things, once again, we see another miracle of God. Another miracle of God happen for the nation of Israel. They see another miracle. They see this walled city with walls that who knows how tall they were. They were tall enough that they would not be able to jump over them. Whenever I think of that, I think back to I don't know if you've ever seen The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. The people, they're in Helm's Deep. And there's these walls all around them. And, the orcs are coming. And they're coming and they bring these ladders to climb over and stuff like that. It would have to have been something that, if they were going to scale the walls, would have had to be something like that. But yet there would have been guards all around in Jericho on top of the walls. Right? And the walls would have been wide enough for a chariot or two to go side by side. I've heard that before too, some pastors talk about that, where the walls of Jericho were wide enough that two chariots would have fit beside. So it could have been 15, 16 feet wide. Just think about a 2-lane highway wide, how thick the walls were at the top. They probably were thicker at the bottom. They probably started and it went up like a triangle. It started, wider at the bottom, and then as it got closer to the top, went to a point. Not necessarily to a point, but got, narrower at the top. So God provided a miraculous miracle in this because he said the walls fell down flat so that everyone could go in straight away. Everyone could go in without being impeded, without having to stop to climb over something. We think about that, it's just, it's amazing to think about this. How it was for the children of Israel. It was almost like the earth opened up right under the walls fell down, and they were able to literally walk across and go into the city without having any walls. And, there's been archaeological discoveries that have happened where they've gone and they've seen this. They've seen what happened in Israel. It was literally the wall collapsed under itself. But it didn't collapse and give a big pile of rubble that they had to crawl over. No, it was flat. So they could walk on it, go in easily, and destroy the city. So they went in, and everything in the city was destroyed. Everything and everyone in the city was destroyed. So now we see the last couple verses. We're going to look at verse 22 to 27. We're going to see this. But to the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belonged to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and of iron and bronze out of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Joshua laid an oath on them at this time, saying, cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds the city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay his foundation. At the cost of his youngest son shall he set up his gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So we see here that they went in and they destroyed the city. They went in and destroyed the city. The awesome thing is as we think and as we look back, there's once again archaeological digs have gone. They've seen that within where Jericho was at, there's charred pieces of wood that they've unearthed, saying that's been burned. So once again, going back and accounting that the stories that we read in the Bible, a lot of these things are able to be confirmed. So we have the secular world going out, making these discoveries, confirming what we see in the Bible. So God kept his word is the last thing we're going to look at. God kept his word. He promised Rahab that the two spies promised Rahab that they would not be destroyed because she helped them, because she had faith in God. Because she had faith in God, she would not be destroyed. So the spies went in, took her and her family out, and they protected them. And they stayed outside the camp. They had to stay outside the camp because they weren't Israelites, but they were part of the camp, that she moved with them. And once again, as we saw a couple weeks ago, Rahab is mentioned in the genealogy of Christ. Rahab was Boaz's father, and Boaz married Ruth. And then we see that happened, and it's just God's forgiveness is miraculous, and he keeps his word. So, how can we apply this to our lives today? Well, first of all, we can see that, we need to listen to what God says. Listen to what God says. If God's telling us to do something, no matter how crazy it may be, no matter how silly it may seem to us, we should do it. Here in the nation of Israel, we're told to march around the city. Typically, in battle strategy, you don't march around something. You march into something. You march into battle. But that's not what they did. They marched around the city. One time a day for 6 days, 7 times. And then they shouted, and then they were able to go in to destroy the land. God did a miracle. And, as we mentioned, obedience leads to victory. So what do you need victory over today? What do you need victory over today? That maybe if you listen to God and obey God, he'll give you the victory over that. Going along with that, what walls in your life need to be broke down, and what things in your life need to be utterly destroyed? I know it seems harsh for God to say to just utterly destroy everything and everyone in the city, but that's like sin in our lives. Whenever there's sin in our lives, we need to wipe it out totally from our lives. We need to wipe it out totally from our lives. A lot of times we put these walls up around certain things that we just won't give into, or we won't give up, that go against what God says in the Bible. But yet we need to break down those walls, allow God to, break those walls, that he can go in and destroy the sin that we're harboring in our lives. We tend to do that. We hold on to certain things because it's hard for us to let go. But what sin and what walls in your life need to come down, and what sin needs to be totally wiped out of your life so that doesn't influence you negatively. As I mentioned earlier, God gave this command to wipe it out so that they wouldn't be influenced negatively by it. What sin? Maybe it's a sin of lust. Maybe it's a sin of greed. Maybe it's a sin of cheating or whatever. These sins that we won't let go of. But yet we need to break down the wall, allow God to break down the walls, so that and utterly destroyed in our lives, so that we can follow him better. And then lastly, we see that God keeps his word. God kept his word to the nation of Israel that he would give them victory at the battle at Jericho. then also, God kept his word when it came to Rahab. Someone who wasn't an Israelite, but yet someone who believed in him. He kept his promise to them that he would not destroy her or her family. So, think about that this week, that listen to what God says. Obey God, no matter how silly it may seem. Let God break down those walls in your life that are harboring sin. And then, listen to what God says, because God keeps his word no matter what. He keeps all his promises. And before we go, I want to, start off and think about what we're going to talk about next week. Next week, we're going to talk about someone who sinned. We're going to talk about, defeat at a battle after victory. The first verse, the first word of chapter 7 is this. It's but. But. So we see the nation of Israel doing all these things, but the people sinned. And then we're going to see the results of that sin. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope y'all have a great week. I'm praying for y'all every day. If you have any questions, reach out. But once again, thank y'all, and I'm praying for y'all.